All right, welcome back. And we have a great panel to get things started today. It's called Managing the GDPR After a Data Breach. And we have just as great of a group of panelists to get this started. Let me start with our moderator, Mark Young. Mark is a partner at Covington and Burling who advises clients on data protection, cybersecurity, and intellectual property matters. He has particular experience in all things cyber. It would take me a long time to go through Mark's background, but unlike most lawyers in our space, he has a master's in information technology. He actually worked as an IT consultant earlier in his career at PwC. He's with us from London today. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Bruce.
Next, Patrick Van Eecke is a partner at Cooley and head of its European cyber data privacy practice and vice chair of its global cyber data privacy practice. Patrick has more than 25 years of experience in this area, and his experience extends to consulting projects for the European Commission, national governments, and multinational global corporations. Patrick is based out of Brussels. We are delighted to have you with us, Patrick. Thank you.
Very happy to be here, Bruce.
Next, I'm delighted to welcome back Ffion Flockhart, who is a partner and a qualified solicitor advocate at Norton Fulbright. Fee serves as co-head of the firm's global data protection, privacy, and cybersecurity practice. Fee's based in Southwest Wales. Welcome, Fee.
Hi there. Yes, thank you. So nice to be here.
Thank you, Fee. Next, I'd like to introduce Robert Maddox of Debevoise and Plimpton. He is a member of the firm's white collar and regulatory defense and international dispute resolution groups, as well as the firm's data strategy and security practice. His practice focuses on complex multi-jurisdictional investigations, disputes, cybersecurity matters, and particularly the international implications of data protection during an incident response. Robert is in London. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you very much for having me.
Finally, very pleased to introduce Andy Ward, who's a managing director in Kroll's cyber risk practice. He has over 17 years of experience in litigation support and digital forensics, helping clients with information governance, compliance, privacy, and risk challenges across North America and Europe. Andy is based out of Madrid, but he's via Dublin today. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for including me.
So this is a perfect panel to kick off IR Forum Europe with top attorneys and consultants from London, Brussels, Madrid via Dublin, and Wales. Mark, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, look, delighted to be back at the Incident Response Forum today. We have a great panel, as Bruce said, to get things started. Look, let's just dive straight in. Perhaps to kick off, we could each just say a word about anything that may have surprised us about GDPR and incidents now that we're 3 years or so in. For my part, one thing that may be surprising is the level of enforcement for breach issues, arguably relatively low, given the level of notifications, very high. So I would maybe just invite my panelists to say a few words on that. Maybe turning over to Patrick or Robert or Fee, would you like to start?
That was too polite, Mark, calling out all of your panel members. So, actually, Bruce already mentioned that I started about 25 years ago, and actually the same month as the Data Protection Directive. Remember that one, the 95 directive in October? That's when I started. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is that when you were asking what has happened over the past 3 years, what's your most kind of experience that is striking you? To me, what is striking is that over the past 3 years, well, most of the discussions we're having about GDPR, they're still the same ones as back in the 90s, still about those very basic principles, about what is now actually personal data, what's anonymous data, what's that kind of pseudonymization kind of thing, when is data protection law applicable anyhow, the famous Article 3.2 kind of a conundrum, what's a data transfer? you name it. We're still having these kind of things. But one thing, though, that has changed is the data breach notification duty that we didn't have in the old data protection directive, and now we've got it in the GDPR, and that might have triggered quite a few new kind of things we will all be discussing later on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Robert, Fee, anything on anything that you found surprising over the last 3 years?
Well, I mean, not so much surprising, but I think what I've been most heartened to see over the evolution over the last few years is really non-EU based clients very much embracing the cultural and actual social underpinnings of our breach notification thresholds under the GDPR, this concept of risk to individuals' rights and freedoms. And I think initially there was a little bit of frostiness towards it. What does it mean? But I think we've very much seen clients, companies getting into, for want of a better phrase, the European psyche on that front. And that's actually been helpful from an outsider's perspective. And I think it's let companies make much better decisions in terms of when to notify, and actually equally important, when not to notify.
Right. Fee?
I think the thing that's possibly a little surprising, or maybe not surprising, but it is there's still, from my and the firm's standpoint, a lot of over-reporting that goes on in terms of incidents, and I think that's probably because of the time frame within which breaches need to be reported under the GDPR, and the enforcement powers, if that's not done within the relevant time frame. And it's I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more, but what it's caused is a huge flood of notifications, obviously, to data protection regulators, and probably practically impossible to properly investigate them all. So they're having to do them of triage. So I think that's one thing that is more of an observation, really. There's, I think, a lot of over-reporting still.
Right. Yeah, and that puts me in mind of some of the the issues in the telco sector years back when they were grappling with notifications more broadly, and regulators struggling with the volume. Now, Andy, you come at this from more of a technical perspective. What's been on your radar, or what's been of interest to you as you look back over the last 3 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a technologist at heart, but I really look at things from the angle of merging strategy around data privacy, legal, and compliance together. So when I think about the overall impact and what I'm most surprised about related to GDPR and PII in general is simply the speed in which attackers are learning. Now, I think we all expect from a technical perspective that people that are hacking into networks and doing bad things, of course, they're technical people. They have all kinds of tools that we probably don't know about. But what's most surprising is the business acumen that a lot of these organizations and individuals have regarding timing and the focus on particular types of data. We're really seeing a lot of activity around corporate transaction where, whether it's due to an inside leak or maybe just a long time access to a corporate network that went undetected, where they know exactly when to impersonate someone and send the right email, or they know exactly where the most saturation of data is going to be. So that's the scary part. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, I see organizations more fully embracing a holistic approach to protection, which is positive.
Yeah, no, that's really very interesting point. Well, look, as we start to delve into some of these themes, let's flesh it out. The audience might be interested to think about some key themes and lessons, and maybe we could start by talking about particularly challenging types of breaches from the perspective of reporting to regulators. And Fee, as we were chatting to prep for this session, we all talked about the prevalence of ransomware and the challenges that clients have been facing over the past year or two in particular. Would you like to maybe say a few words on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as everybody knows, there's been a huge spike in ransomware, and essentially the double threat of encrypting the systems and exfiltrating data, and having the ransom in relation to both. And from a the point of view of notification, the issue that raises, obviously from a GDPR point of view, is this availability issue. So what we're seeing is clients technically needing to report at a much earlier stage because systems are not available than they would otherwise if it was a different type of attack. So that's certainly been a challenge. And when all of the forensic folks on the call today or the webinar today will know that one of the key things you have to have in order to get some kind of certainty as to what's happened during an attack is visibility across the environment in order to really know what's happened and what potential data has been impacted. But with ransomware, very quickly systems are encrypted, systems are down, and so that timetable gets shifted quite a bit, and things have to get done in max speed. So that's certainly a challenge.
Yeah, and also coordinating the response under those circumstances and actually affecting the notification can be somewhat challenging. Anyone else want to comment on experiences with ransomware in particular? If not, there are a number of other issues that we've been seeing, including closer to home, multinationals that post-Brexit have lost their main establishment and lead supervisory authority. And I think, Robert, you had said that this was something that you'd seen come up from time to time in the breach environment. Trying to work out the ramifications of this is difficult.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. It can really it can have a very significant impact on the speed of your incident response and reporting to regulators if in the midst of a breach you realise that actually post-Brexit you no longer have a main establishment in the EU, and then the knock-on consequence of that, of course, being you don't have a lead supervisory authority. And that really presents two challenges. The first is obviously under pressure and with limited information and time available to you, trying to determine, or one, do you have a main establishment in the EU anymore? And if you do, where is it? And I think one thing that I just highlight on that question is a lot of clients, a lot of companies actually seem to think that they have a choice and you can simply select where your main establishment is, but it's more a question of fact actually when you look at the legal test there, and that can again come as a little bit of a shock. So that's challenge number one, actually trying to work out what your position is under time pressure. And the second is a consequence of that. If you don't have a lead supervisory authority, are you actually ready to be able to notify potentially a multitude of different supervisory authorities across the EU, and not only notify them, but deal with potentially disparate levels of follow-up, different questions from the different supervisory authorities when they come in? And I think those two sort of forces and the fears about having to notify multiple supervisory authorities has actually led some companies to have to make maybe the best way to put it is forced decisions about whether they have a lead supervisory authority under pressure.
Yeah.
And those, I've personally not seen those decisions be tested, but I think if I get out my GDPR telescope, I'd probably think that in the future they will be. Not least because if you think about it from an economic perspective, it's the lead supervisory authority that if they impose a penalty, they get to keep the money, and money makes the world go round, as they say. So I think that's something where we may see more pressure. And if I step away from all of that, what I really think it brings us to is what I'd like to call the golden thread of the quilt of incident response, which is a little preparation really goes a long way. So I'd say to everyone on the event today, really, if you haven't thought about this question about post-Brexit, who your lead supervisory authority might be, previously it was the ICO, I think it's time well spent to engage with that now.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and of course it has broader ramifications outside of breach, but that's for another day. Now, Andy, you have got the. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to add to that point.
Yeah, please do.
completely agree with Robert there. And we have seen instances where some data protection authorities have rejected that designation. With international companies having said, no, okay, that forced choice that you were talking about, Robert, we're going to go for Ireland, is the one I'm particularly thinking about in this case. And the Irish data protection regulator has said, actually, no, we're not taking this one on. So it's a very real issue.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Switching gears a little, there's some of these topics we could spend the entire session on, but switching gears a little, Andy, you have the pleasure of working with a lot of lawyers in your day-to-day work. Tell us some of the best practices to working with legal teams from a kind of forensic point of view.
Yeah, Mark, absolutely. So when I think about the first steps, often, when we're being approached, it's directly through counsel. It could be, through the end consumer organization, but our first step would be to recommend involving counsel to make sure that, for a variety of reasons, from the reasons that you started to discuss, figuring out jurisdictionally what your duties are and starting the ball rolling there. But once counsel is involved, it's really involving Kroll in a technical plan. And basically, our approach is, within minutes of being notified, we have a plan in place to help the clients, find the problem, contain it, try to start operationally restoring where we can, and really minimizing the impact on business. That's a whole separate thread and conversation, and we could certainly talk about everything that involves. But when it gets into kind of that next step of starting to conceptualize notification, not quite getting there, but conceptualizing it, we just focus on the facts. So the same kind of forensic process and chain of custody for collecting evidence for a dispute or a litigation would be followed, and making sure that everything is defensible. And then as the facts emerge, and as we can see, well, what definitely happened, what definitely didn't happen, and what that gray area is, where maybe the attacker had access to a certain file share and a certain set of files, but maybe they didn't do anything with them. We get very granular in the way that we converse with counsel and the client about that, because that's really where things meet. If we can prove that someone exfiltrated a large amount of PII, millions and billions of records in some instances, then the approach is fairly cut and dry. But if we can only prove that there's some chance that the attacker had access to it, then that's really where counsel comes into play. I will say that I've seen all kinds of different approaches be taken. There's certainly instances where there was a conservative approach taken, and that worked out well. And there'll be other instances where notifications didn't take place, and later that comes back to bite. And it's really just doing that risk assessment. But first and foremost, preserving that duty to do what you need to do based on the jurisdiction. So that's kind of how I think about things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, though that dynamic is always interesting, and depending on how the response kicked off as well can really colour it. Just final point, as we're talking about getting things started on key themes and lessons, Patrick, one thing that we were chatting about earlier is breaches leading potentially to phishing or being phishing expeditions. Do you want to say a word or two on that?
Yeah, sure, Mark, because this is really something I started noticing over the past few years, and what I'm actually worried about, it is you as an organization, you suddenly got confronted with a data breach, and you've got those 72 hours within you need to decide, are we going to notify or not? And very often when you do that notification, you will get, very often for the first time, you will get on the radar screen of a data protection authority, one, maybe more data protection authorities. What I've seen in the past is that very often these data protection authorities, it attracts their interest. And so they will follow up. Yes, of course, thank you for the notification. But by the way, could you please tell us who is your DPO? Who is your rep? Because we believe you're not based in the European Economic Area. So who is your GDPR rep? Could we see Europa, your Article 30 register? Right. You notice that many companies who indeed got that in the heat of the data breach, they suddenly come to you and they say, what are these guys talking about? We have no idea. We don't know. Yeah, sure, we got an incident response plan, but we don't have a representative. We don't have a DPO, these kind of things. And suddenly the whole kind of data breach becomes a regulatory compliance exercise. It becomes a fishing expedition with one very kind letter. When you respond to it in a very kind way, and by the way, you have to respond. It's Article 31 or something of the GDPR that you need to cooperate with the data protection authorities, and they always go deeper and deeper into your compliance, in the level of maturity you've got as a company. Actually, what do we see nowadays? Many data breaches that have been notified are not sanctioned, but because of the data breach, you as a company, you incurred another sanction because you didn't have a DPO, or the DPO you got was not an independent DPO following the Data Protection Authority, that kind of things. And that is something we need to be worried about, for the simple reason that very often we do talk about the ICO or CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority. These are very well mature data protection authorities with professionals who know their stuff. But out there, we've got more than 27, many more than 27 data protection authorities, because in Germany, you've got at lender level, you've got DPAs. They are lacking personnel. They've got 2 junior people. A kind of notification breach or breach notification is handed over to a junior person who comes just right after comes out of university and will start working on it, and you end up in a very difficult situation. Which reminds me of what you just said. We probably often over-report notification data breaches, and we very often end up in a situation where we didn't want to be before.
Yeah, no, it certainly can be open a door to various other issues, and we might touch on the kind of somewhat arbitrary reaction of case officers at certain times. I'm sure we've all experienced that. But any reactions to what Patrick said?
I mean, I would say I completely agree. I think one thing that companies can do is, if they suffer a breach, it's difficult, but if you can start thinking in parallel about, have you got all of your ducks in a row from a compliance side as well, then actually better late than never on some of these pieces of documentation. And yes, maybe it wasn't in place at the time of breach, but if you can say that you've taken it very seriously, that it came to your attention that X or Y was missing, that can maybe buy you some goodwill down the line if, as Patrick says, it comes under scrutiny from the authorities.
Yeah, I think it also, I mean, I completely agree. I think it also goes back to the point earlier on about over-reporting, right? If you pull that trigger, you have to be prepared for it to either go in and the file's closed very quickly, and we've seen that happen a lot as well, but there is that risk that you're opening a Pandora's box. And to Robert's point, you should be comfortable that you have all your ducks in a row if you're putting in a precautionary notification, which seems to be the thing that most people are keen to do. I mean, as a firm, we advocate really digging into the technical detail, really establishing whether that trigger point has in fact materialized before pulling the trigger and potentially opening Pandora's box, as I say. Right,
exactly. Well, look, having fleshed out some themes just to give our audience a bit of a sense of where we're going, I think we might say a word or two about timing. We might talk about reporting strategy for global breaches, touch on the approach of different regulators across the EU. We've already started that, and maybe some practical tips and process points. We've got 25 minutes left. I see in the chat some questions on various topics like maintaining privilege and ransomware. We may have a specific session on ransomware, so unfortunately we won't dedicate particular time on that. But in timing as our next topic, in the run-up to GDPR, there was a lot of focus on this 72-hour issue. Many companies just saying, how on earth are we going to deal with this? Has it been a big deal in practice? And specifically, and I think this will be relevant for many of the people who are listening today, the importance of communications between local entities or European subs and often US parents. Robert, Fee, would you like to get us going on that topic?
Yeah, sure. Happy to say a few words. I mean, the 72 hours I don't think has been a real issue per se. Everyone on this call probably has seen the very light touch notification that you put in because you found out about the breach 71 hours after the client discovered it, and you've just got to get something and you can do it. You know, it's not ideal, but you can do it. I think we're still seeing organizations tripping up on the awareness point. And it is that theme of communication that you mentioned, Mark, about making sure that the InfoSec team, the IT team are escalating incidents appropriately to legal or privacy, whoever is actually making the call on these issues. And yes, I'm sure we would all love it that the 72 hours started from when your legal or privacy team became aware of the breach. That's not the test. And I think it was that issue that a lot of companies focused on originally in the early days of GDPR and getting to grips with the breach notification regime. But I think more recently, specifically post the Irish DPC's Twitter fine, it's what's really come to the fore is you can't let these issues get stuck outside of the EU either. And there, of course, Twitter Ireland was effectively charged with Twitter in the US's knowledge on a constructive basis about a breach and ended up paying the consequences for it. So I think really what it comes back to is making sure that practically you've got a process in place, you're testing that incident response process, and you're also giving the people who are part of it appropriate training, because people who see the initial incident reports from a technical perspective, they need to be versed in these issues and know what to be looking for so they can be escalated efficiently. And if you want to avoid one thing, I think it's let's avoid IT becoming sort of the Las Vegas of incident response, where what happens in IT stays in IT, and it's or equally what happens in the US stays in the US. It's you've got to have this holistic communications plan.
Yeah, really good points. Fee, do you want to come in on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, the Twitter case is the thing, right? We haven't found it in practice to be a huge problem where there's a data controller, so yeah, as a company using a data processor who is completely arm's length. You need to have those processes in place so that the processor knows to inform the data controller about a breach in a good period of time. But I think the thing with Twitter was having that US parent as the data processor. It didn't wash with in that particular case with the Irish DPC, and you can understand why. And so it's extremely important that when it comes to global organizations, in particular, I would say post Twitter, where you have another part of the global organization acting as processor for you, you really need to make sure that things are notified to that data controller very quickly as part of embedded processes, because you will, post that case, be deemed to have constructive knowledge. And if you don't then notify within the relevant 72 hours under GDPR, then that will be a breach and obviously a fine followed in that particular case. I'm sure that principle can extend to companies beyond the group companies. It's just we haven't seen it in practice, but it may well be something that that pops up more and more. What the regulators are really concerned to make sure is that data controllers know what's happening with data processors. They have that adequate control.
Yeah, and breach is just one area, I think, under GDPR where you have that tension potentially between an EU sub and a often US parent. Can play out. Patrick, I think maybe you also wanted to come in on some of the repercussions of having become aware.
Well, Robert, you already touched on that actually it all comes down to those two questions. Becoming aware of what? The data breach, the incident, or the qualification as likely a risk or a high risk. And so it has never been clear But on the other hand, it also looks like the data protection authorities, they don't care too much if it's in 72 hours, in 80 hours, in 90 hours, in 128 hours. No, they're concerned about several weeks or several months after the whole issue. That's what we see in practice. But what we also see in practice is that the whole discussion going on about the assessment of the severity of the risk. Is it a risk to be reported? Is it a high risk for the data subject also to be reported to the end users, to the victims? And so there we notice when you're in these kind of incident response teams, you very often have difficult, emotional even discussions between security people, IT people, legal people, HR, CFO, CTO. It escalates about, is it a risk? Is it a high risk? Has it to be reported or not? And there, at least that's the practical experience that I have and that we at Cooley use. We developed a tool to get out of the way of that subjective kind of assessment. We developed a tool based on an algorithm which is taking into account the EMEA, so the European Cybersecurity Agency criteria and algorithm. We worked together with them because it had to be updated, as you know. It was predecessing the GDPR. But so together with EMEA, we updated the new rules and so added new criteria and also included the EDPB guidelines, etc. And so the beauty of it, of objectivizing actually this assessment, is that you just respond in a consistent way to the same questions. It will be scored, and then at the end you get a result, whether it's a risk or a high risk, etc. And then still it's up to you. You refer to privileged. Well, it will be running on the system of the law firm.
Right.
And so you will not have to share if it's not necessary. But very often, as we all know, even if it's not notifiable, you need to document that you've done the assessment. So then you just push the print button and you've got your report, you have it documented. What we've seen in the past, it really brings some fresh air within the discussions, within the organization, the discussions, again, between those same kind of functions. You could say, no, this is what it is, measured along the objective criteria. Now we're going to be discussing what we're going to do with it, with the results. The data protection authorities, they like this kind of methodology because what they are very often refraining companies is that we as companies, we don't have a consistent approach when it comes to assessments of data breaches. And they come to you, they say, oh, thank you for this notification, but we know about another data breach about 6 months ago that you didn't report. Could you please explain why you're reporting this one and not the one of 6 months? Because we got a complaint there. And if you're not able to explain that you've been applying consistently the same criteria, the same methodology, you end up in a very difficult situation. So that's why we got a tool for that. There are probably many solutions, but that's why it's important to indeed have a methodology in place, hopefully with some algorithms behind it to get rid of that kind of discussion.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting development. Yeah, so the timing has been an issue, and it's interesting to see how that's panned out. But let's pivot. I want to bring in Andy. I'm conscious that we've had a lot of talk from the lawyers on the panel so far, and Andy, I'm going to bring something up because we chatted about reporting strategy when dealing with global breaches and best practices, and some of the issues that we see in practice is a kind of panic when individuals from multiple jurisdictions are involved, and an immediate assumption, often incorrect, that then necessarily triggers notification obligations in particular in all jurisdictions. But one thing that is important when dealing with these breaches is having a single version of truth and developing this for notifications. And of course, a very important part of that is understanding the data set. And I just wondered if at this juncture you might say a word or two on that, given potential cost implications, consider some do's and don'ts, just the importance of understanding the data set and the role that plays when we're dealing with potential global ramifications.
Hi, Mark. Absolutely. And I'll I just wanted to quote, I think it was Robert earlier who said the golden thread is preparedness. And I will say absolutely the thing that bridges all of the topics that we've spoke about so far is having a plan. It doesn't necessarily have to be a sophisticated plan, but it needs to lend itself to that standardized and communicated approach that Patrick mentioned. And part of that plan involves understanding what actually happens from the technical perspective after an incident. Incidents come in many shapes and sizes and impacts, and understanding what happened from a technical perspective, it's important, but it's really understanding the scope of impact, right? Because if we can say incidents happen extremely frequently, think about MasterCard. Me personally, I've had my MasterCard replaced 3 times in the last year. Just them saying, we think there was a breach for reputational reasons and because we can afford it. We're just going to send all of our customers a new card, even though we don't really know what happened. And that's a very sweeping approach to things, right? And for a credit card company, you can see why they would do something like that. The cost is minimal, and the upside of or downside of not taking that approach, and if something surfaces later, could be catastrophic. So when we're working with customers that aren't in those obvious situations or obvious markets, whether they be law firms directly protecting their data or corporate or government entities, we really look to first understand what's happened in the past with these organizations. How often are they breached? What types of breaches? And then that allows us to protect. But once a breach has happened, it really is digging into the details. So those amongst the crowd who have forensic experience or litigation support experience, it's about filtering down and understanding, okay, from a security perspective first, what do they have access to my earlier point? If there's a gray area where they may have had access to something, it's understanding the types of content, and then often doing data sampling and trying to put a fence around, okay, in a worst case scenario, they got 1 million people's data with a medium level of saturation. And then if the company and council can value the risk of an approach on one side, and then on the other side, if we can say that there's no chance that this breach ended up in a leak of PII, and they only took these 3 files that have nothing to do with PI, then it becomes an operational discussion, and the GDPR thread is cut. So those are the types of things I think about. I'm happy to go into detail about the actual techniques we use to filter, but they're very similar to other big data and forensic approaches where you're looking at types of files, access dates, doing textual searches and conceptual analytics at times.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. A couple of quick fire follow-ups, but pivoting back to some of the legal issues as well. Robert, one thing that we talked about, you're faced with that data set, you've got your single version of truth, and you're having to deal with multiple notifications. I think you had discussed just very brass tacks issues around forms, issues around guidance, different regulators saying different things. Maybe you could say a word or two on that topic.
Sure. I mean, I think on incident response, there's no question the US is a few years ahead of us in terms of maturity of the market and things like that on all sorts of fronts. And but there's a two-way street of learning, of course, and we don't just learn from them; they learn from us. But I think one thing that I take from the US is quite common there, actually, to make notifications to state AGs and other regulators using a letter, even if a notification form exists. And I think that you don't see it spoken about a lot, but the reality is you can notify European data protection authorities using a letter if you choose to do so. They might ask you to fill in a form after the event, but often actually what we've seen in practice is they don't, and they accept the letter as long as it meets the statutory criteria. And I think the benefit of that approach in the right case is that it helps you create consistency. I mean, Patrick spoke about consistency of when you're notifying. I think there's also consistency of what you're saying between the different regulators and not wanting to get out of step, and having a single letter especially in a global breach. I mean, I'm not talking just within the EU. I mean, global breaches, 65 different jurisdictions involved. Having a single, not just a single source of truth, but a single source of regulatory talking points and regulatory notification can actually be the most efficient way forward in the right case.
Yeah, it's a great point. And a related issue, of course, is we've all been there where PR are breathing down everybody's neck. We need to get out to the market. We want to say something positive about this fee. Any reflections on that challenge?
Yes, I think the lawyers always want to make sure that things are put in an accurate way. But the issue is that normal people don't speak in an accurate way. And when you put, an accurate sentence in front of a PR team, they'll say, look, we can't issue that. It sounds horrible, which is true in a lot of cases. So it's about working with the PR team really closely to make sure that what's put out is not only accurate, but reflective of the culture and character of the company. So it doesn't look different. It doesn't jar with their customer base. And the key thing in strategically managing a global incident, when you're having stakeholders, counterparties, customers, brokers, all sorts of incoming questions from all sorts of different places, is to maintain that consistency of messaging. And the practical ways that we've dealt with that in the past is to make sure that everything is funneled into a single source. So, you'll often have single mailboxes for the employees of a global organization so that they can ask questions through that inbox, and then another inbox where everything else is gathered from other stakeholders who have questions. And then the answers to those questions can be consistent and triaged from there. What you want to make sure is that nobody's answering questions ad hoc in various places within the organization, because the message will be lost and you'll lose the consistency and accuracy of it. And that could be very damaging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, let's just say you manage all of that on the one side, on your consistent message, but then the report forms start going in, and what we start getting back is perhaps not always particularly consistent from regulators. Patrick, I know this is something that you've seen, and maybe there's a call for greater consistency from regulators that would benefit organizations. Anything on that point?
No doubt, we do see, and very often the English-speaking community, I would say, forgets that on the continent, English is not spoken as a native language, which means that the Polish DPA and the German DPA, the Italian DPA, the Spanish DPA, the Portuguese DPA, they all have their own meetings. They all come up with their own ideas on how to deal with GDPR. And you do see deviating positions. Of course, they come over to Brussels and they have the European Data Protection Board. Of course, they do have joint guidelines. But when they go back to their countries, they also serve their own country, their own population. They have their own meetings. They have their own kind of audience they need to serve. And so there, you really notice that when dealing with the Garante in Italy, you're going to have to do that in Italian. When dealing with the Portuguese authorities, you're going to have to do that in Portuguese. And we need to realize, especially our US companies, our US clients that we are serving, that when you have a data breach, it is not always a good idea to bring an American team that's going to be the spokesperson and speaking in English and bringing the same message to a member of the Italian Data Protection Authority, for example. So you need to be sure that you've got the right people in place who know also about the culture, that you work together with a local council. Probably. But having that said, the kind of experience that we have as international organizations, that we have as international lawyers, it is experience that we need to share with the data protection authorities, because they don't have that international experience per se, and they want to learn about these things. So that's why it's so important also to have this kind of conferences where both sides, but also as for example, John Maas from the ICO will be joining us later today, that we have this kind of open discussions, because we all want to go for the same thing. We want to have a safe environment from a data protection perspective. So that's the only thing that I wanted to share from a consistency perspective.
Just to add one more, well, we must never forget the industry regulators on top of the data protection regulators, right? So we've often find that, particularly in financial services, the financial services regulators will be driving that agenda. They will be wanting more and more information at a pace which is possibly faster than the data protection authorities. And therefore, if you're working to that pace, you need to make sure that you give the right and the same level of information to the data protection authorities, possibly at an earlier point in time that you necessarily needed to or wanted to, because you don't necessarily have all the information confirmed. So that's the other thing that's thrown in there. There's lots of different regulators to think about.
Yeah, that overlay of the sector-specific regulation can, it gets even more complicated, and the order in which you go in, which countries, etc. That's a really interesting point. Of course, in all of this, and I'm conscious we only have a few minutes left, we won't be able to cover it in detail, but we've focused a lot on notifying the regulators. A large part of this is also about notifying the data subjects, and I just would be interested to know any reactions to different types of data subjects and notifying them, and maybe what issues should be top of mind, say, when notifying employees versus consumers. Any reactions or considerations on that front? I open it up to the panel to weigh in on.
A quick thought from my side. I think when you're dealing with employees, appreciating you're going to be dealing with imperfect facts often, especially in a ransomware attack, but sometimes a proactive approach, a quick email blast can actually go quite a long way if you've already got a fairly high degree of certainty that employee data is going to have been exfiltrated as part of a ransomware attack, for instance, because if your systems are down, people are going to know that there's something is going on, so the cat's already out of the bag to a certain extent, and you can sometimes get ahead of that a little bit. You probably aren't going to do that with the same way with consumers, outside customers, but for employees, it can sometimes work quite well, I think.
Yeah, I think the other thing we see with employees is for certain companies who've possibly held on to employee data for a little bit longer than necessary, particularly after the employees left the company. For employees that have left, so former employees, if their data set is in there, we tend to see a lot more questions from them if they've been notified. We also see a lot more questions or DSARs, data subject access requests from employees. Information has been impacted, which itself causes all sorts of issues, and data deletion requests as well, which consumes a huge amount of time and resource to deal with.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, Fee, about the former employee exposure that can really lead to a world of pain. Well, look, I see Bruce has arrived in the corner, which is our cue to wrap things up. I'd like to thank all of my fellow panelists for starting us today. Bruce, back over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Great job moderating, and thanks to the panel. I promised everybody this was going to be a great panel to kick off the day, and you all did not disappoint. Thank you so much.